sign on and support it because, it's a lot of right-wing interests that are supporting this. But at the end of the day, we need to get away from using jails and away from using police, and this is one way to do it. So I wanted to mention that just to kind of start tonight, and then I'm going to go ahead and introduce Andrea Merida, who's going to talk a little bit about our guest. So thank you all again for coming, and
So my name is Andrea Merida. I have the fortune of holding several hats in the Green Party. I'm the co-chair of the Denver Green Party. Julie, raise your hand. She's the other, Julie Banuelos, my hero, is also the other co-chair of the Denver Green Party. I'm also the state co-chair of the Green Party Colorado, along with my comrade Dave Bell. Raise your hand, Dave Bell. And I also happen to be one of the national co-chairs of the Green Party of the United States.
What a hobby.
So we're really, really excited to have this incredible turnout and to be able to talk to you and to present someone to you that we're so honored to have in our cosmos in the Green Party, who means so much to human rights and to liberation struggles everywhere. Before I bring him up, though, I wanted to let you know, in a way, having Mr. Baraka here is sort of our Green Party offering to this community here in Denver and in Colorado. It is no secret that we live under the regime of neoliberal government, both here in Denver and in other cities as well. And so it's important for us, and what we're trying to convey through the inspirational words that you're going to hear today, that we have to stand together. That this Green Party can offer to this city our core values, which is people, peace, and planet over profit, right? And I also want you to recognize that whether you decide to vote or register green tonight or not, and I may ask you, that we are partners in this struggle. We as a progressive and left coalition, we are partners together in this struggle. In our state party recently, we have undergone a revolution because it is important that for us as a combined struggle, as a movement, we must deal with the open justice issues that are left undealt with. And I mean in particular, the restitution and the reparations that are owed to the Native American people on whose land that we sit today. This is the land of the Arapaho and of the Cheyenne. Our tradition in the Green Party of Colorado is that we always recognize that we're on stolen land, right? But I also want to recognize that there can be no justice until we finally have justice for the African American community in this country. And so, I just wanted to read something very quickly, because in our revolution that we just had, we have declared that we are an intersectional party for the people. And so I just want to read just a couple of brief things from our bylaws. In keeping with the Green Party's third pillar of social justice, the Green Party of Colorado declares itself to be an anti-oppression party, actively dedicated to the work of ending capitalism and dismantling white supremacy and heteropatriarchy. As such, and I want to be very clear about this, as such, expressions of sexism, racism, classism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, and other oppressive behaviors are not in keeping with the values of the Green Party of Colorado. And then we pop down and we say, further, the Green Party of Colorado explicitly rejects the false ideas of reverse racism, misandry, etc., because we understand the role of white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, etc., in the oppression of our comrades of all colors, all genders, and sexual orientations. While it is possible for prejudice against white people, against men, against cisgender people, against straight people, or any other privileged group to exist, this prejudice is not oppression, because there are no institutional power structures designed to disenfranchise these privileged groups. So we mean business. We mean business. We are the party of people, peace, and planet over profit, and we mean to be partners in this struggle. We have an amazing group of people of left and progressive folks who are going hard in the paint for the people of this state and of this community in general. So this is our offering to this progressive community. And I want to introduce my friend, who is a human rights activist, who's currently the national organizer for the Black Alliance for Peace, and is going to help commemorate this momentous occasion of the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. It was a time when we were about to take a turn, and we were going to do something different, and it was taken away. But it doesn't need to stay away. And so my friend Ajamu Baraka, who also was the 2016 vice presidential candidate for the Green Party, who on the ticket was the second highest vote getter for the state of Colorado, aside from Ralph Nader. Aside from Ralph Nader in 2000, and so I'm extremely, extremely happy to introduce to you my friend and yours, Ajamu Baraka.
All power to the people.
To the people, all the power!
All power to the people.
To the people!
My brothers and sisters, comrades, I really appreciate you coming out this evening. We say all power to the people because that, in fact, is our historic mission, and in fact, our historic responsibility. We can't do anything but raise up the people on a day like today, a day when we come to remember the life and legacy, the sacrifice of our dear brother, Dr. Martin Luther King. We raise up Dr. King this evening because in raising up Dr. King, we also raise up and salute the people. We say that because it's important for us to understand that we celebrate Dr. King, but we understand that without the people, without the struggle, there would be no Dr. King. Dr. King didn't make the movement that we celebrate and associate with the 1950s and the 1960s. Dr. King came out of a motion already in place, a movement that was developing. Dr. King went to Montgomery as a young preacher, 26 years old, came from the elite family of Atlanta preachers in Atlanta, Georgia. And he came to the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And like a lot of young preachers at that point, he had a chance to take up that position at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church and to become yet another middle-class Black preacher. But there was something that was happening in Montgomery. The people in Montgomery had decided they were going to resist the expressions of apartheid in that city and to boycott the buses of Montgomery because they wanted to end the inhumane and backward discrimination that Black people had to endure in that city. We all know the history of Rosa Parks, and we know in this audience, I know we all know that basically that was not a spontaneous move on her part. She didn't get up on the bus one day and decide she's gonna sit down and get arrested. Now, we know that's all right for part of the fable, but it's important for us to understand that that was part of a conscious decision made on the part of the activists in that city. They knew they wanted to target the bus line. They knew they had to do that because the Supreme Court had given a weapon to activists in the South with the Brown decision a year early in 1954 that basically gave them an opportunity to begin to chip away at the official apartheid system in the South. But they knew that to get rid of apartheid in the South, you had to struggle against it. So they decided they were going to attack that bus discrimination. And so they began the process of organizing that boycott. E.D. Nixon, one of the major organizers, decided that he needed someone that could be a spokesperson for that activity. And who better than this young preacher from Atlanta? And he was asked to join the committee and to begin to speak on behalf of the strugglers there in Montgomery. Now, it's important to also remember that the foundation of that boycott, the ones that did most of the work, that don't always get much of the credit and recognition, were Black women. And it's a reflection of the contemporary patriarchy and sexism of the time, that despite that reality, we still had to have a Black male, a Black man to be the voice of that resistance. But the point is that basically history swept up Dr. King. We know the results of that boycott. It was successful. They broke that part of the apartheid system, and we know that Dr. King went on to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and to be part of the evolution of resistance in the South in the late 50s and into the 1960s. In that process, then, Dr. King became more and more prominent. But again, that prominence came out of struggle. And it wasn't just Dr. King and SCLC. We know that one significant event that happened in the struggle was in 1960, when the students in North Carolina decided they were going to embark on a series of sit-ins to again address the issue and to bring attention to the apartheid system that they were still attempting to chip away at. And that activity and the activity of CORE and the Freedom Rise and all of these activities elevated the Southern struggle and elevated the fight for human rights in the South. And it elevated the standing of Dr. King. We know that by the mid-1960s, though, that as the movement won certain victories, the movement was able to force the Democrats to come to terms with their internal racism, to deal with the Dixiecrats that controlled the South. You had a one-party system in the South, and the Democratic Party was reluctant to address that one-party system because the Dixiecrats were part of the Democratic Party coalition that had been in power since the 1930s. But as a consequence of the pressure from the people, they forced the Democrats to address their internal contradictions. And they forced the Democrats to, in fact, get behind legislation that would bring certain kinds of reforms to address apartheid in the US. And we know some of the victories, 1964, the Civil Rights Act. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act. Significant, very important. But there was a contradiction. After the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, something like 5 days later, what happened? Watts exploded. So even though you had these legislative victories, the issues with Black oppression went beyond just the South. It went beyond just apartheid in the South. It was pointing to some of the more fundamental elements related to the structure of this society, the structure of the economy. But in 1965, Dr. King had not completely made those connections yet. 1966, the movement in the South was somewhat dissipating. There was a recognition on the part of SCLC and even another organization that we don't talk enough about, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, who were the real, in some ways, the real sort of guerrillas, if you will, in the movement in the South. Both organizations began to understand that they had to link up the Southern struggle with the struggle that was ongoing in parts of the rest of the country. In those places where you had significant numbers of Black people who had migrated from the South and migrated to these various urban areas to seek employment and to take advantage of the new opportunities that have been opened up as a consequence of the end of the Second World War and the U.S. emerging as this predominant power, and the compromise that was made between capital and labor that allow for the working class to begin to benefit from some of the facts of U.S. dominance globally. That is to allow for the working class to, in fact, elevate its lifestyle, to earn higher wages, to, in fact, maybe buy a little house out in the suburbs. These were the good times that people talk about in the 1950s, right? How they elevate the 1950s and into the 1960s. But those good times weren't experienced by everybody, okay? So those Black folks who migrated in the second migration to these areas to live some of that, to get a piece of that American dream. But instead of the American dream, they faced instead systematic oppression. And the response eventually was resistance, rebellion. And that's what we had Watts, and eventually Detroit, and Newark, and all of the other urban rebellions that took place in the 1960s. But I don't want to go too far and too fast. So by 1966, Dr. King and SCLC were making certain connections. Dr. King relocated from the South and went to, where did you go? Anybody knows? Chicago. And there he had a chance to see firsthand and experience lifestyle in a urban slum. Now, that was very important. And this is where there's some intersection here with myself. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I lived in one of those slum buildings. And just in case, I know most of you all know, but those slum buildings were those buildings that these landlords bought up. A lot of times they were just large houses, and they would then cut the houses up into what they call kitchenette apartments. So you take a house that was a single family house, you cut it up and put 3 families in there, okay? And we ended up in one of those places. It was 3 families in this house, You had to share a bathroom upstairs. It was full of rats and roaches, but it was a very profitable business for people who were buying up these houses, cutting these things up, and putting all of these black folks who were looking for a better life into those houses. So Dr. King came to Chicago and saw those realities, those economic realities, and he began to make connections. 1967. We know we have the intensification of the Vietnam conflict. The U.S. has gone off to liberate Vietnam, and in the process of liberating Vietnam, they were sending these African Americans and these other working class folks off 8,000 miles to bring democracy and freedom to Vietnam. And black people and others were getting to Vietnam and saying, wait a minute, we don't have freedom in Chicago. We don't have democracy in Alabama, but you're sending us to Vietnam to fight for that. Something ain't right. And already by 1967, there was resistance in the military. Okay? So these things started coming together. Young men in Chicago that Dr. King was interacting with, he said, Dr. King, you talk about nonviolence. You tell us that we need to turn the other cheek. And people praise you. But Dr. King, what about the fact that this government is sending my brother or my father or my uncle to Vietnam, and they're not sending them to turn the other cheek. They're sending them there to wage war. How do you square that, Dr. King? How do you tell us not to listen to those voices that were saying that we had to resist through any means necessary? How could you criticize those voices and not say anything about your own government? And Dr. King, being the person that he was, that is someone who is attempting to live a principled and consistently moral life, he listened. And even though at that point, there were other voices that were resisting the war, resisting the draft, he wasn't quite ready yet. But by April of 1967, in a speech in Riverside Church in New York, Dr. King, on April the 4th, 1967, Dr. King said, I can no longer remain silent. I can no longer counsel nonviolence to people in the ghetto while my own government was going off and committing these horrendous crimes in Vietnam. And that's when Dr. King came out in opposition to the Vietnam War. But he didn't just come out in opposition to the Vietnam War. He made the connection between warmongering, militarism, and the plight of poor and working class people. He said that Vietnam was a symptom of a deep malady in the heart of the American society. He said that Vietnam and the fact that there was support for the Vietnam War, and we got to remember that there was still significant support for the war in Vietnam. That's why we had to have that kind of resistance against the war, because you had significant sectors of the population supporting that. He was saying that the very fact that you had significant sectors of the population supporting the Vietnam conflict was reflective of this sickness in the soul of America. And we use that term for now. We don't refer to the U.S. as America normally. But he said that this reflects a sickness in U.S. society. So he made those connections. He said that basically there's a connection between racism and extreme materialism and militarism. He said that, there's a reason why people are in rebellion to the U.S. There's a reason why the shirtless people, the peasants in Vietnam, were fighting the U.S. and resisting, even though they were being subjected to horrendous bombing and militarism. He was saying that in the world, there was something happening. There were changes taking place. There was a world revolution taking place, and that the U.S. was on the wrong side. So he was making the connections. He said that in the U.S., you cannot claim to be concerned about the poor and the working class and support the war in Vietnam. He said in that speech that basically the resources being used to murder and maim in Vietnam and around the world were coming directly out of the pockets of the people in this country. So he said, what we need to do is not only to oppose the war, but what I'm going to do, he said, we're going to build a poor people's campaign. We're going to organize poor people and working class people. That he said, I recognize now that I may have made a mistake. He didn't say this in this particular speech, but he said it. He said, I was trying to bring about integration, but I may have been encouraging my people to integrate into a burning house. He recognized that the issue wasn't just the morality of individuals, their consciousness, their personalities. He recognized that racism wasn't just a psychological phenomenon that had to be defeated. He began to understand and recognize and articulate the fact that what we were up against was more than just individuals, but against a system, an oppressive system. And what that suggested to him was that there had to be a fundamental change. A change in how society was organized and a change in how we thought and saw the world. And that's why he called for a radical, revolutionary change in values. He said that basically we have to have a new ethical framework. So he made all of these connections. But in making those connections, Dr. King became even more dangerous. Because at the time that Dr. King was making those connections in 1967, you already had in various parts of the country, those connections already made and people already in motion organizing against the system. But with Dr. King's participation, Dr. King's value, Dr. King's moral standing, that gave those efforts around the country even more value and more importance, and made all of those efforts more threatening. Because even though Dr. King and NCLC were involved in trying to eliminate racism, and we're talking about integration and all of that was done within the context of a commitment to the existing system, an ideal that the existing system could be reformed, and the notion that the people who were being primarily impacted were Black people. But now, Dr. King is saying that the problem is more complex than that. That not only is it concerned with Black people, Black working class people, Black poor people, but that the concern is, because the impact is pervasive on all working class and poor people in this country. And that made Dr. King a threat. So the combination of Dr. King's opposition to Vietnam and the organization of the Poor People's Campaign, in many of our estimations, that is what put a target on Dr. King. 1967, SCLC declared itself to be a human rights organization. Now, what that meant was that, again, you see these changes, you see these connections being made. Dr. King and SCLC was just coming to a point that Malcolm X had already arrived at in 1964 and 1965 before they killed him. In 1964, when Malcolm made his change, he said basically that the Black movement in the US had to move from a movement of civil rights to human rights. Malcolm said that if you limit your demands just to the Constitution, that basically you are limiting, your vision. That you are making this a legalistic struggle within the context of the US. He said that what we really had to do in the US was to properly define it, something we'd already tried to do in the late 1940s. And that is that what we in fact had in the US was a human rights struggle. Okay? Now, again, Malcolm had made those connections. He made those connections to the traditional Black radical tradition, to the Black radical tradition as it relates to human rights. Okay? In 1946, 47, we defined the struggle in this country as a human rights struggle. But that got squashed because, of the impact that had around the world, and the fact that the U.S. government decided that this was too much of a threat. And by the early 1950s, anybody who used the term human rights were automatically then, in the first McCarthy period, defined as a communist or someone who was in alignment with the Soviet Union and the Chinese. So you stopped using that term. I'm gonna come back to that in a minute. I know I'm doing a lot of stuff, but I'm gonna walk us through, okay? So Dr. King in 1967, the SCLC, they made those connections, okay? They said this is a human rights struggle. And what that suggested, of course, was that if this is a human rights struggle, it means that the US government is a human rights violator. Okay. So, Dr. King, being the principal person that he was, he made all of those connections. But like I said, Dr. King in some ways was catching up with what was happening in other parts of the country. But by making those connections and being a figure that can bring all of these efforts that were taking place together, it meant that Dr. King became the #1 threat. Now remember, there was a little program that the Democrats' best friends today were attempting to implement, meaning the FBI. There was a program called COINTELPRO. And the essential element of that program was basically to destroy the emerging movement, Black liberation movement, to prevent the rise of what J. Edgar Hoover referred to as the Black Messiah. And with King moving in a more radical direction, with the possibility of linking up with the other more radical elements, that suggested, when you look back at this, that Dr. King had to go. He had to go. So 1 year later, this day, 50 years ago, this Prince of Peace, standing on a motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee, there in Memphis, attempted to not only organize the Poor People's Campaign, but to struggle in solidarity with sanitation workers. A struggle that even members of his staff told him not to get involved in. Like they told him, don't come out in opposition to the Vietnam War. But standing on that hotel balcony, we have been told that James Earl Ray fired the shot that took our dear brother's life. And as a consequence of that, we saw that the Poor People's Campaigns stalled. And we saw that murder as really the opening shot by the U.S. state against the entire movement. So I walk us up to this point to help us to contextualize Dr. King's life, to contextualize the struggle of Black people and poor people in this country. Because, certain events, have certain kind of symbolic meaning, but they also are the beginnings of certain other kind of historical trends. And when I say that Dr. King's murder was the opening shot, what we see is that 1968, there was this coming together of these various radical forces, including another important organization that emerged out in California. You might remember that one. And what was happening was that the state had decided that it was going to launch a military assault against our movements. And so taking out Dr. King was really the beginning of it. And when you look at what happened in terms of the targeting of not just the Black Panther Party, and people, we have to understand that the Black Panther Party was important, but the Black Panther Party did not represent the extent of the Black radical movement here in this country. But we know that they did bear a lot of the repression. But between 1968 and 1972, there was a series of military assaults against our movement. People were murdered. People had to go into exile. And people are in prison today from that period. Okay? So what happened beginning in 1968 was the beginning of what I consider to be the U.S. state's counterinsurgency against the Black liberation movement. And that counterinsurgency had two elements. It had a military component and it had an ideological component. The ideological component was that what the state decided that they were going to do was to try to create the conditions so that there would never be a generation of Panthers, of SNCC organizers, of the Revolutionary Action Movement, of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. They said they wanted to make sure that another generation like that would not develop. And the way you do that is ideologically, is you use your cultural and ideological weapons. You use mass education. You do what we have seen done to other people here in this country. We're talking today about what happened with the Chicano movement in terms of how they use the educational system to break up that movement by targeting young people by making it, by stigmatizing speaking Spanish. You know, we remember what they did to our native brothers and sisters by forcing young people into these boarding schools where they could murder the Indian consciousness. And they were doing the same thing for us. But we don't always think about this in those terms. And so I'm going to just share something that might sound controversial, but I don't think it really is. What was the purpose and the objective of this acceleration in busing in the 1970s? You know, part of the mythology of the civil rights movement was that it was a movement for integration. That's not really true. That movement was a movement for democratic rights, for desegregation. It got redefined as some kind of notion about integration. You know, the issue with our community wasn't that we didn't have no white folks to sit next to. It was because we didn't have resources in our community.
That's right.
You know, we want resources. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. 95% of my teachers were black. We had, and I consider this, and I'm not being chauvinistic, I really believe that I had a superior education. Yeah. Using, well, check this out. But we had books. I don't know if they still have this, but you know, you get your books, and you have this little tab in the back that you sign your name and put a date, you know. But our books are so old, you can see your cousin who had the same book 8 years earlier, and you know, and all of that. You know, and that's why we learned the value of books, because we knew we couldn't get those books replaced. So you had to take care of your books, okay? But we use those books to the max. Before we had all of this, you know, the whole desegregation thing, you know, black folks that went off and got their masters and their PhDs, they couldn't just go off and get jobs in white institutions. Now we had advanced degree making institutions like Atlanta University, McCary, they produced our doctors, Howard University, okay? We had a whole network. That's why when I was growing up, when we got sick, we went to a black doctor, a black dentist. All of the teachers, like I said, were black, okay? So we had a network already in place. So, you know, this is what we need. We needed resources. We didn't necessarily need to integrate ourselves into non-existence. So what they began to do in the 1970s, my friends, was they began to chip away at that sense of independence, of self-determination, and they targeted our young folks. And the objective, in my opinion, was the quote-unquote Americanization of the black person, to in fact make the African an African American, with an emphasis on America, okay? So, you know, that is what we had to begin to deal with in this country as a result of the repression that we were experiencing from this government. We go from the 1970s to the 1980s, and now we have the full counter-revolutionary process. That with the ascendancy of the new right under Reagan, understand this now, the new right was ascending even under Jimmy Carter. You know, we incorrectly assumed that Jimmy Carter was this bleeding liberal. That wasn't, that's not a fact, okay? Jimmy Carter is the one that began to move toward neoliberalism in the 1970s. In the 1970s is when the system turned toward neoliberalism. And the turning toward neoliberalism was part of the global counter-revolutionary process, my friends. First initiated in where? Chile. Right. Okay, by force. That's right. All right. So part of the counter-insurgency and ideological counter-revolutionary process was it was bringing into place this turn toward neoliberalism. And that started even under Jimmy Carter. The right was organizing, the more obvious right. Remember that term. The more obvious right was organizing. And so basically by 1981, they had assumed nominal control of the state. The right wing, people who call themselves conservatives, decided to target the Republican Party to build their movement and to ascend to power. And they were successful with the ascendancy of Ronald Reagan. At the same time you had Ronald Reagan ascending, you had Margaret Thatcher in the UK. This was a period of the full-blown neoliberal counter-revolution. Okay? The 1980s are a key decade. Key because what happened in the late 1970s? Well, in 1979, we had a little conflict that ended up, I think, at least temporarily successful in a place called Nicaragua. In 1979, we had another conflict process that we thought ended up pretty nicely, at least for a while, in Grenada. In 1980, you had the liberation of Zimbabwe. In the 70s and 80s, you had the intensification of struggles in places like Guatemala, El Salvador. Okay, you had this revolutionary thrust, you know, and you had all of this hope that there could be fundamental revolutionary change around the world. You know, we had the slogan, Africa must be free by 1983. And we said that with complete and utter confidence, because, and some other gray hair folks in here, y'all remember, we really and truly believed that we were going to win.
May I have your attention, please? It is now 6:55. The third floor museum will be closing in 5 minutes.
We heard that, thank you. We really believe that we can win, okay? And we believe that because we had, even though we were facing all this massive repression, we had these revolutionary forces that were still in place. We had all this movement, even though there was mass confusion among our forces here in this country in the 1970s. In the 1970s, we had the rise of the various organizations, left organizations, and all the, we'll go into that, that's a whole nother discussion. But we had a lot of motion. So by the 1980s, you can't understand it today, but I understand in the 1980s. The 1980s was the decade of counter-revolution, okay? So the 80s put in place the conditions that ended up with things like the collapse of the Soviet Union, we call it collapse, in the 1990s. And the ascendancy and the consolidation of the neoliberal project in the 1990s. With the neoliberal project fully in place, then basically what that meant was that the US economy was already being restructured in the 1980s, but that intensified, okay, with globalization, neoliberal globalization. What that meant was that the labor capital compromise was now over. It was over really in the 1970s. And it meant that the capital could impose discipline on the working class. And that's what they did. And what that meant basically was, this is over with. Later for this thing called the American Dream, okay? And it resulted in the offshoring of the industrial base, the restructuring of the US economy from one that was no longer dependent on manufacturing to now servicing. It meant that the wage structures were now undermined. It meant that cities like Baltimore and Trenton And all of these little industrial towns throughout Michigan and Ohio, it meant that those towns were now no longer important centers of commerce, that they could be allowed to basically decline and decay. Okay. Now, my friends, I know that we're doing this because I want us to understand where we are today and why the importance of Dr. King's commemoration is important for us today. Because when you look at what's happening since 1968, you see the pattern. That what we are facing today in 1968 is something profoundly different. But yet the structures and the interests are really the same dominant interests. But how those interests are now manifest are different. What do I mean by that? I mean that basically that we have the restructuring of the economy, but we have the same class that was dominant in 1968 is dominant today. We have the hegemony of finance capital as a consequence of that restructuring, and we have something very important we have to talk about as a consequence of all of this. In 2018, unlike 1968 when it comes to the Black community, this is the bookend I'm coming to. As a consequence of neoliberalism, as a consequence of our movement being fragmented.
May I have your attention, please?
And
It's now
defeated.
7 o'clock. The third floor is now closed. If there are any papers on the floor, please make your way down at this time. And the library will be closing at 1 hour.
The situation of the Black working class in this country is more precarious than ever before. What do I mean by that? In 1968, Black people, Black labor still had a role to play in the economy. In 2018, we no longer have that same role. In 1968, we were able to provide labor, secure minimum wage jobs. Our low wage and low skilled labor was important. There were still low skilled jobs we can get, and there was a role for low skilled labor. In 2018, that's finished, that's gone. If you can't get a job in the service industries, then basically you are now superfluous. And in fact, to a large extent, Black working class labor is now redundant, superfluous. We're no longer needed. We were talking about this today, that basically a young, maybe not young, but a Black person who's able to secure a job at the minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, which translates into about $15,500 a year. That means that is the extent of goods and services that person can consume, right, and generate. You take that same Black and brown body now, put them in a prison, and now they can generate $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. So instead of someone being in the free economy, you have more value now incarcerated in the free economy. That is a recipe for genocide.
Yeah.
That's the reality we have to address and face today. That's why it's so dangerous to see these confused, knuckle-headed Democrats who align themselves with these dominant forces to prop up the intelligence agencies, to put in place today what I think is a very dangerous phenomenon that we are calling the new McCarthyism. That basically we are facing a situation that is approaching genocide, but we are unarmed. It's difficult for us to resist because people are so confused. You know, part of what we did in this campaign was to attempt to raise the contradictions, to give people an alternative, to suggest to the American people that, you know, there's an analysis out there that says that the issue in this country isn't just, you know, what representatives from one of the two major capitalist parties will be in power. But the issue is that this society has to be restructured. That we have to have, that as part of that process, we have to have a transitional program. And that transitional program is reflected in the program of the Green Party. That basically what we say is that, you know, and I've always been crystal clear about this, that you would never hear me stand in front of an audience and say that the Green Party platform and program in our campaign represented the panacea for this country. Yeah, we want to have an alternative to the fossil fuel industry. We want to have a Green New Deal. You know, we want to eliminate student debt and have free education. You know? We believe in Medicare for all, improved Medicare for all. We want to have living wages, but we understand that to get to that point, we have to struggle. But even in that struggle, that's a step toward where we have to go. Where we have to go is radical fundamental change. So the party's platform becomes a tool toward that change, toward building that alternative power to take us to that next level. So we've always been clear about that. That's where we are today on this 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination. That we are in many ways facing the same but yet profoundly different conditions. That today we can no longer pretend that this system can be reformed. Today we have to come to the conclusion, as painful and as scary as it might be for some people, that if we're not talking about radical change, that we are perpetuating the illusions that will keep our people enslaved. And we have to say that with confidence and not worry about the consequences. You know, the people are looking for honesty. They're looking for people to be for real. And we have to be for real.
That's right.
We are the ones that have the platform and program for that for realness, that authenticity. Okay? And we don't need to be self-conscious about that. We need to figure out how we, in fact, move that process through the Green Party. We have some strategic thinking to do with our friends who are parts, who represent other organizations, but who have values and principles that are in alignment with ours. We got to figure out how do we build and concentrate left power here in this country. Because we're not going to be able to defeat this concentrated dominant power with a fragmented left. So the issue of left unity has got to be put back on the agenda for the conversation. So we are clear, and we must get even more clear as we think about what it means today with this anniversary, if you will, of the murder of Dr. King. This day today is a day in which we not only think about how we got here today, but we have to come to terms with what we need to do to, in fact, move forward. And I will end from where I began, that Our responsibility is to build power. Our historic task is to build independent power. That we have to remind ourselves that, in fact, we have the power. We just have to organize that power. We say with absolute clarity and conviction that we must have principles, but we still place people, planet, and peace before profit. Let's build a new world. As Joe always said, and I think it's something that we have to remind ourselves of. You know, we always have this power. It's already in our hands. And what I've always said is that we can always control the conditions that we're born into as human beings. But we can determine how we respond to those conditions. And for many of us, we have said we're going to struggle and we're going to fight. Let's fight together. Thank you.
So this is a free will offering for the Black Alliance for Peace. So we've got computers in the back there if you only have your credit cards. If you have a check or if you have change or cash or whatever, see Kathy and Eric back there. We also have a sign-up sheet here somewhere in case you want to get on the mailing list for the Green Party Colorado. I don't care.
Right back here, same location.
Great, okay, great. Great. Listen. I don't care if you only have 50 cents on you. Cough it up for Black Alliance for Peace. We have to do this on our own. Okay? Now, thank you. So we're going to have a few minutes of question and answer. So I'm going to invite you all to be comradely with each other and not take up 5 minutes, and be sure that you have an actual question and not a speech, please, because we have to be out of this room in about half an hour or so. So please, let's be somewhat conservative about our time and comradely with each other in the time that we have left. And so we'll take hands, and then we'll have Mr. Baraka answer the questions. Let's go with Elizabeth and then begin.
Good evening, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll read this so that I make sure that I answer it. You mentioned that we know about COINTELPRO and those sort of forces and how parties of destructive agendas infiltrated and damaged movements of the past. I wonder two things. I'm asking you two things. To what degree do those forces still exist, either in that iteration or in a new form? And what can we who are activists and movements do to ward off the ways in which they would be able to
Thank you. I think that in terms of those forces that still exist, I think they in fact do exist. We had the exposure of COINTELPRO as a consequence of a break-in that exposed the fact that that program existed. And then we had the Church Committee hearings in 1975, 1976 that really revealed the extent of the criminality of the FBI, CIA, and other agencies in terms of their illegal activity targeting U.S. citizens and residents in this country and really abroad, because our struggles wasn't just confined to the U.S., of course. As a consequence of certain changes that Congress demanded that the FBI engage in, all it meant was that the FBI had to change its tactics. And what we see happen was they began to farm out to international intelligence agencies the surveillance of components of our movement until they had a more favorable environment in the 1980s. So we have to remember that the FBI, we're talking about an investigative unit, but we're also talking about a structure that engages in counterintelligence, counter-espionage. We're talking about a structure that is basically a structure of political policing. So they're not just accumulating information, but they are engaging in counter activities against what they consider to be threats to U.S. national security. That's why they have come up with new kinds of definitions. Many of you have heard of, because it was revealed a couple of months ago, that those of us who are still involved in building radical movements, who happen also to be Black, they have a new category they use for us now. We are now Black identity extremists. And what these kind of terms do is they dehumanize you, and they make you eligible to be repressed, and even eligible to be murdered, to be quite frank, okay? So, but we understand the threat, and we're not going to allow that to undermine the work that we have to do. But, my long-winded response is that yes, we know that that is the task of that agency. We understand that, and we accept that we have to be mindful of those kinds of attempts to try to undermine our movement building activity. I would argue that what we see with Russiagate is nothing but a series of psyops that they have allowed them to execute against the American public over the last year or so. And that's part of what the FBI does. And what is interesting is that there's this collaboration now between the FBI, CIA, and NSA that 15 years ago we would have been really upset about, but it's been normalized and accepted.
Yeah.
And part of why that's happening is because we're now involved in a full-blown new McCarthyism. That you have the Russiagate has been a gift given to the state by these confused Democrats using this notion, this campaign ploy that the Hillary Clinton campaign used when WikiLeaks exposed the shenanigans of the Democratic Party in undermining Bernie Sanders. But instead of looking at the emails, when they released the emails, instead of looking at those emails and seeing how undemocratic the Democratic Party was, they shifted the attention of the public with the collaboration of the Clinton News Network, CNN, and they used the notion that this was a hack by the Russians, and so we were looking at this supposedly the intervention by the Russians to undermine U.S. democracy. Okay, so that ploy then became a convenient tool once the unthinkable happened, when Donald Trump actually won the election, and then it went into full-blown Russiagate, and we know what happened because see the real scandal of what's happening in this country is and see what's so funny now. You know where you got to go to get a clear reading of what's happening with the scandal with the FBI and CIA and NSA.
RT.
You got to go to RT.
Yeah.
And you got to go to Fox.
Yep.
Because in them trying to defend Trump, they're actually exposing the criminality of what happened. That when the FBI and when the three agencies, when they did an off-the-shelf a move, and something that they have been known to do in the past, like when I don't say that. So they put in place. They selected these intelligence analysts, and as Ray McGovern says, the ex-CIA analyst, he says that whenever you have a situation like this, where they select intelligence analysts from the different agencies, what you are in fact putting in place is to ensure that the outcome of that analysis is what you're looking for. So they pulled analysts from the NSA, CIA, and FBI. It was to put in place what Peter Strokes, his name, said was going to be an insurance policy just in case Donald Trump won. Now, this was the individual who was he wasn't so small potatoes. They tried to frame him like he was some kind of just, ordinary FBI agent. No, he was the director of the counterintelligence division. And they were in collaboration with elements of the CIA to basically, create this information that they then took to the FISA court to get a warrant to begin to surveil the Trump campaign. That's wild. Then you had these agencies, you talk about interference in democracy. They were basically on the side of the Clinton campaign to surveil the Trump campaign, using a dossier that was paid for by the Clinton campaign. Now that is wild and criminal, and you would think this would be a huge scandal, and it is. But MSNBC and the Clinton News Network, they are keeping the attention on these other processes as opposed to that. But it's all unraveling now. It's all unraveling. So, how do I get this? So my point is that these nefarious forces are still in place. How do we counter those forces? Well, it's going to be difficult right now. What we have to do is to be organized, not be intimidated by these forces, understand how they operate, understand that as we try to build left unity, that they're going to be trying to do the opposite. Understand that we have left forces in this country that are very weak and confused, and not let that dissuade us from what we have to do in terms of organizing ourselves and taking our messages to the American people.
I'm honored to meet you finally. So I saw you earlier today on Brothers Jeff's program, and I know that you know the history of this neighborhood. This was once a very proud Black neighborhood. And what I want to talk about is internalized oppression. A lot of the displacement that's happening in our city right now has been ushered in by fellow people of color. And I, for one, am very tired of seeing my city and my neighborhoods or my Black and brown neighborhoods getting sold out. Now, you put your name on the ballot at the national level, and I know you had a lot of people of color coming to you and saying, don't do this, work within the systems, work within the structures that be, and change those. But how do we, what should our reaction be to people that sell us out?
Very good question. First, we have to expose them clearly, and we have to organize against them. See, part of the way, one way in which they're able to get away with this is that their activity is sort of obscured. That the gentrification processes we see here in this city and across the country is framed as modern new urban development. Okay, and as you correctly pointed out, the point persons for these processes are usually people of color, and in many of these major cities up north, they are Black folks, Black Democrats. These processes are taking place in cities controlled by the Democratic Party. Okay, and yeah. So basically, and moving around this country, the pattern is absolutely clear. And so, there is a lot of folks like yourself and everybody in this room that sees this, but the resistance to this is not being organized. We've got to call it out for what it is and tell people that the Democratic Party is their enemy and be unequivocal about that. Yep. Okay? That's what we're trying to do. But it's we can shout at the enemy and it might make us feel good, but it's not enough. We've got to organize. And we've got to organize with the understanding that there's no short-term solutions. You know, during the campaign, we said this campaign wasn't just about the vote on the 8th, but it was about what happens after the vote. And I pledged that basically for me, being on that ticket meant that I was going to commit myself to attempting to strengthen the oppositional apparatus, in this case, the Green Party apparatus. And so after that election, that's exactly what I've been trying to do. That's why I'm here today. Because Andrea said she wanted me to come to Colorado, and we've been working on this, and I'm here, you know? Because what we're trying to do is to, you know, to give people the tools they need to use me to the extent that I can be used to help you all in your local organizing, because it's all about local organizing. So this struggle we are in is a long-term struggle. You know, we've got to gear up for 2018, but it ain't about 2018. We got to be ready for 2020, but it ain't really about 2020. If we understand what the terms are and what we have to do in terms of building a viable alternative, then we got to be looking past that and understand. In my opinion, I think the breakout year for the Green Party and the possibility of some kind of left coalition of forces is 2024 or 2028 at the latest. Not only because of what we have to do, but because of the sharpening contradictions. This system is facing a serious legitimation crisis. And part of what is happening with that crisis is that even the limited democracy that we have in this country is now being seen by the rulers as an impediment. So you see more and more criminality. That's why you have that off-the-shelf operation by the Obama folks who control the state at that point, you know? And you're gonna see more of that regardless of who's in power. That's why we are involved in the new McCarthyism. The new McCarthyism is what? Using the gift of Russiagate, they have now moved, they've been given weapons they always wanted to have to control access to information and radical analysis. So they have, in collaboration between the state and these gigantic information technology companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, they're now involved in essence, censoring the social media. You got Facebook talking about counter speech, a private corporation. We just had another fight. I think some of y'all know about this. Twitter has been censoring the Black Alliance for Peace. We had to struggle against them 2 months ago because they were blocking us. They wouldn't allow people to share our stuff. And we had to have a public campaign for people to demand that they stop. They stopped it. And they started again last week.
Yeah, it's blocked. Yeah.
It's still blocked?
I mean, it's basically you can't share. So if I tweeted something right now that was controversial, then basically my entire, no one can connect with me. Like, it would be very hard. If Brother Jeff tried to go to Denver, Portia, then basically I don't exist, but yet I do exist. So you have to be careful. And then how many times you post. So if you go through a day and you post too much, then you can know me. My name's Denver, Portia. You won't be able, we won't even connect. We go back almost 40 years. And that's how Twitter's got it going. Right.
Well, they told me yesterday they had stopped it.
No, they've curtailed it. Basically what they have done is if they've stopped it, they minimize what you can do. If you overdo it, then you get blocked.
We didn't be overdoing it. We will put out one thing in the morning, right, and it'll be blocked. But my point is that it's not just us, it's other sites. And Google has altered their algorithms, and we all know about this. So basically, those radical sites where you can go and get radical analysis, where ordinary people who might, put in socialism, and then, what'll come up will be some sites where you can go and get a decent definition of socialism. Now you put stuff in like that, and all these goofy sites come up, written by the right wing, because they altered it so that, it's more and more difficult for you to get access to real, authentic, radical analysis. And the general public, they're not really aware of that. So they think that what they're getting when they do these searches is authentic. And that's really the essence of fake information. But this has been started as part of the new monotheism. They're basically, they're making even being part of a third party challenge a criminal offense. They tried to say that the campaign was part of the whole Russian Kremlin conspiracy. And you all know that the campaign is under investigation, right? Okay, and Dr. Stein's been cooperating, but this is what they're trying to do. And then they started tweeting saying that basically we're part of that whole Kremlin conspiracy. So what they tried to implant in the minds of the American people that if you support a third party challenge, you are in fact being un-American.
Yes.
Okay, so next we've got Don Jorge. I want to go with this gentleman in the back. You, sir, then you, sir, and then you. Okay?
I really appreciate you being here.
Much nicer.
I'm gonna do it real fast. She's my daughter. And why do I say that? Not because it makes that big of a difference. How many of you here have your father or your mother here? How many of you that are fathers have your children here? And I think that that's important. It is important because we cannot depend on Facebook or on Twitter. We have to be the backbone of the fascist state that is about to take over. When we are going to be able to talk to each other and to talk to our neighbors and to talk to our family. How many of your family share your views? You have to evangelize your family. Because if you don't, then you're growing enemies in your family. And if we're going to resist fascism, we're just going to take over. It's about to. If we're going to resist it, you got to have the people that love you and that you love right next to you.
I love you, Poppy. Sir? You, sir.
To piggyback off of what he said, is that, to name some names, Koch brothers, Rothschilds, Bacon, the Beards, who have wrapped their tentacles around our children. Corrupt tentacles. What do we have in place to have our children ready to make the move to break the power that we are going through? Because see, I think for a lot of us, as adults, we are selfish. We are about ourselves. But we have to be about our children if we want real change to happen effectively.
Yeah.
Exactly. I'm just going.
You, sir, back there.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, in terms of what you were just talking about in your last answer, if some elements of the corporate media, if some elements of the ruling order, not just here, but in Hungary, India, are accusing each other of fake news, then what you were calling a moment ago a legitimation crisis is also an epistemological crisis. So I guess my question to you is, what tactics do you recommend in the face of that so we can direct our neighbors, our comrades, our students back towards critical analysis? What are the tactics if all of the media doesn't know who to believe, let alone the masses?
Well, let me start with your response first. I think that the media, I think they already understand what is and what isn't fake news because they are the ones that are producing fake news. So I think that question is really no longer a question. The issue we have though is that as a power move, they have been able to now undermine the ability of us to provide alternative views using these marvelous tools of social media. That, for example, when Google made its announcement, it was going to make these adjustments with its algorithms, and it was going to put in place money to help to boost up alternative, more authentic sources. The stock prices for the New York Times went up because the mainstream journalist outlets always had a concern with what they called citizen journalism. You remember that? There's always concern about these new journalists who were, distorting the news and that being professional. But they couldn't really move against them. But now they can. So in terms of how to respond to that, well, first we have to struggle to maintain the spaces we still have in social media. We can't just surrender those spaces. So we have to struggle to make more people aware of the kinds of censorship that's taking place. Many people don't even know. And I think when people find out that the government, along with the private sector, is attempting to infantilize the population by deciding what kind of information you might be able to absorb, I think people would be outraged. I know many of the libertarians are making a lot of noise, and even some elements of what we call the lunatic right, but it is the liberals who are in support of this. What we have now is been, what I call has been part of this new McCarthyism, is liberal totalitarianism.
That's right.
And a liberal authoritarian personality, okay? And you see it manifest all the time. Now, in terms of the young folks, we have to struggle to win as many people as we can to radical struggle. Understanding we up against some powerful forces. And I give you an example. Those young folks who are concerned about the issue of gun violence, who in their concern, we are led to believe, in 22 days, organized massive marches across this country, including that massive march in Washington. Now, folks, some of us have organized before. To organize something like that in 3 weeks is very difficult, okay? And when you look at what really happened was that, and not to criticize these young folks, I know they're concerned about their issue, but they're being manipulated. Okay? That they have been hooked up now with the Democrat Party related machine. They sunk millions of dollars into these young folks. They put in place the apparatus that basically was responsible for these marches. And they're being used now because this thing about gun violence and gun control is a Democrat Party issue, no matter how much merit it may have. So my point is, these are the kinds of forces we up against. Now, these young folks, what we need to do to help them to make the proper connection is that if you're concerned about gun violence, and we all should be concerned about gun violence, you need to also be concerned about U.S. militarism. If you're concerned about gun violence, you should be aware of the fact that the #1 arms dealer on this planet is the U.S. government and its private corporations. So we don't want to just condemn these young folks. We want to help them to make the next logical connection with their concerns, to have those concerns properly politicized, okay? So they can become a real force. Now, when they start making those kind of connections, the money's going to disappear. Okay? But that is our job. That's our responsibility. Okay? And I just want to make a quick comment about the comments from your father. In those comments, now I understand everything,
I'm going to come to you in a second. I just want to also remind you that the International Socialist Organization my comrades, my brothers, I love them. They're in the back. They're one of the co-sponsoring organizations. Now's the time for study. They've got the books. So on your way out, when you're giving a donation to Black Alliance for Peace, check out what they've got for sale over there. And then please go ahead. And then that will be the last question.
Thank you very much. My name is Lorraine Joseph. I'm here today on behalf of the Green News Network with Tony Smith.
Okay.
And what I wanted to ask you specifically was, what are your thoughts or your insights on Mr. Jared Polis, Democrat, who is now wanting to run for governor of our sovereign state of Colorado?
My thoughts would be in line with the consensus of the Green Party of Colorado.
We can offer some insight.
But any specifics that are on that? I watched some of what he had to say about the Family Medical Leave Act on the anniversary of that, and I myself was not impressed with the disorganization, but I would.
He supports privatization of education.
That's right.
He calls PBS left anti-Semitism.
That's right. There, and that's all, there it is.
That's all we need to know. I mean, how many times do we really find well, I shouldn't say that. It's very difficult to find a person running under the Democratic Party platform or banner that has all the right, positions.
They all have Palestinian blood on their hands.
That's right.
That's right.
So
We asked that guy to join us in Elyria and Global and Swansea fighting against the expansion of I-70, and he told us that's not an important issue. 45% of the population, children in that area, have more asthma and more respiratory diseases and more heart diseases than anybody else in the city. But he didn't care to even take a stand.
Let me make one final comment, and just to basically thank all of you. I wish we had more time, but I know we have to get out of here in a few minutes. Sometimes I know it can seem very difficult for us, but I just want us to remind ourselves that we are in fact on the right side of history. Yeah. And that we should, as we think about Dr. King and think about, we're not going to just think about Dr. King and feel sad about the power of the state and how repressive the state can be and all of the array of forces we have to contend with. We have to remind ourselves that what we are today is the consequence of mass struggles to open up the democracy that we do have, to make the progress that has been made, and that we are at the cusp of something really significant. And all we have to do now is understand our potential power and organize ourselves and be the leadership that we know we have to be. Build the structures we know we have to build. And when we get tired, and we are going to get tired, just, think about people like Andrea's father, who's still in the struggle, who still have that vision and that fire. Think about people like that you know, and that'll help lift you up, and that's what we have to do. So my friends, we're going to continue to fight. We're building a new formation, the Black Alliance for Peace, and we're committed to peace, but we're not naive. We understand that without justice, there'll be no peace.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, the tagline of the Black Alliance for Peace is that we are a people-centered human rights project against war, repression, and imperialism. And we understand that to advance that struggle, we have to fight, and we're prepared to fight. So I want to thank all of you all who may have helped us this evening with your contributions. I want to thank, and I really like how the Green Party here has builds and maintains relationships and connections with all of our various left forces and friends. It's really impressive. Thank you all for coming out. Let's continue to struggle for for unity. Let's find those common interests that we all have, and let's build the kind of radical left that the people deserve. Thank you.